Hey everybody, welcome back. Today marks episode 7. I know, crazy, right? We've been doing this for 7 weeks now. I want to thank you all so much for your support and your love. And again, another big thank you for the big 10,000. I just hit 10,000 subscribers, so I want to thank you guys, and I appreciate you all for digging my content so very much. So speaking of all the newer subscribers, some of you might have noticed in the past, I want to say 30 days, I've been kind of rehashing some older stories that I'd posted on my channel. In fact, I've even made a couple of compilations with those, but especially more so I want to say in the past 2 weeks. Well, a lot of that's due to the fact that I'm getting so many new subscribers. Not everyone necessarily has the chance to go back and check out all of my content from a year old. And not everybody does that. So this is a way to let newer people listen to all the older stories I have. And if you've been with me since the beginning, it's just kind of a re-listening to the same good content. So just wanted to clear up that. I know I haven't really been posting a whole lot of Dogman stuff lately. I've been trying to let that topic breathe a little and just kind of give more light to my channel by posting, maybe some more paranormal stuff, different kind of creatures. Wasn't that long ago I actually posted that flying humanoid video and just things like that. I'm not moving away from Dogman. In fact, actually in these next couple weeks, I'm going to be posting a lot more Dogman since that's why most of you are here. That's the reason why I'm sure you've clicked on this very video. And that's what a lot of my audience is largely based of, is Dogman stuff. So that will be coming back, so don't you guys worry. And speaking of which, I have so many of those darn videos now, I really need to come up with some sort of numbering episode system versus just calling it a name and X amount of Dogman encounters. So I think you all will start seeing that in the coming weeks. All right, so now that we've moved past all the introduction, let's go on and get with the stories. So today's topic is going to be the 5 Dogman encounters that was posted about 3 or 4 days ago. And so this should be pretty fun. We're going to go ahead and dive into all 5 encounters of the video. And let's begin with the first story. This happened to me last winter, and I haven't seen this creature since. I'm not quite sure if this thing moves around or possibly even migrates from area to area. I can say it's a predator I didn't know existed, and I keep a very close eye on my surroundings now, no matter where I go. Where I live is about 10 miles out of town. I have several old fields around my house from where the last people who lived here had horses and other livestock. Beyond the fields are woods, and these woods go on for miles. And if you go back far enough, the land goes down into a creek that runs along the area. There's a lot of deer out here too, mostly does, but you do see the occasional buck or two from time to time. Like I said, mostly all doe. In fact, I pretty commonly see the same 20 or so doe that lives in the area about all the time. They bed down under a tree not far from my house out in the field. To give a little more detail about my house, it's a little older and larger, so it takes a lot to heat up, especially in the winter. In fact, because of where our wood stove is, it's not uncommon for us to go through 5 or so cords of wood every winter. And that's counting November to March. So we always try and prepare our wood well. Normally, since we have so much wood, I have a wood splitter set up in my woodshed, so I can do all my splitting and stacking right there. Once I get enough wood split and stacked, I try and keep the wood holder that's right in front of my house stocked full, so I don't have to make long trips out to the woodshed every time I need to put a log on the fire. I think this is a pretty common thing for most people who have wood stoves and rely primarily on wood stove heating. In the morning before I leave for work, I usually try and have my wood holder outside my front door, full of wood for my wife, so she doesn't have to go into our shed. But this particular morning I was running late, and I can't remember why. My wife had to make do with the small wood that was there, which was left over from the day before, and so it wasn't until I got home that evening that I got an earful, and I had to go out and make sure that she had plenty of wood for the following day, which was my bad. I usually like to keep it filled up just for her. It was dark out since I get home closer to 6, and I was going to grab some split wood and fill up our wood holder. I remember stepping outside my house and noticing the air feeling different. Do you know the feeling that when a thunderstorm approaches and the air feels heavier? That's how it felt, except it was January and it was frigid outside. Okay, so this already is a really interesting detail right here in the story where this individual talks about the air feeling different. Now, for those of you that don't know, this is a pretty, I don't know if I would say common, but it definitely comes up more often than not in stories, not just involving Dogman, but other various cryptids and paranormal and unexplained events and things like that. They describe the air as feeling weird, it feels heavy, it feels staticky. That's probably the most common description that I've read. And a lot of it actually does go back to talking about the whole thunderstorm thing. And if any of you have ever experienced a thunderstorm, which I'm sure most of you have, you know that the air does feel different. It's like there's more moisture in the air. There's more of an electric charge in the air. I don't really know how to describe it, but it definitely does feel different. It does kind of have a staticky kind of feeling to the air. And that, to me, would lead me to believe that it's electromagnetic based. So why is it that there's so many cryptids that give off this feeling? Or, I'm sure people have also talked about the smell of sulfur, which I've read in other accounts too. I know a lot of people that that's demonic, but regardless of whether it's demonic or not, it's still just a weird occurrence that always, I shouldn't say always, but will commonly occur with, I've heard it about Bigfoot. I can't say Dogman for sure, but definitely with other cryptids before, because it's not a super uncommon thing to smell. So there's static in the air at this point, and things are about to get hairy. No pun intended. I thought it was weird, but quickly brushed it off and walked my way to the shed. As I'm in the shed, I'm grabbing some pieces of wood to put into the holder. I began to get a bad feeling, like someone or something was hiding out beside my shed and was waiting for me to walk out so they could attack me. I keep a knife in my pocket, but with my arms full of a bundle of wood, I wasn't going to offer much of a fight. I felt nervous. I wasn't sure why I was feeling this. We've lived here for years, went through the same thing every winter, been out to the shed and back 1,000,001 times, never had a problem. In fact, the only predators we've ever seen around these parts are coyotes, and maybe a bobcat here or there. Our neighbors are so far away that we never even see them, and I don't ever have anybody just wandering up my driveway knocking on my door. I've never felt uncomfortable any time where I live. At the time, the feeling was so intense, I honestly imagined somebody walking up my driveway planning to hurt me and my family. I tried to brush those thoughts aside and tried to forget about the feeling I had. I walked at a brisk pace back to my front porch to begin loading up the wood holder. As I'm crouched down stacking the wood, the feeling of dread intensifies. What's worse is at this point, my back is completely against the woods and woodshed. I'm defenseless right now, a thought that would not escape me. Okay, so things are building, it's intensifying. So not only is the air staticky, just he happens to walk out and the air feels different. So it's like wherever these things go, they change the air around them, and I'm not sure why that is or what that has to do with anything or how that would even connect with other things. Like some people claim, it's UFO related or interdimensional related. Some people claim it's flesh and blood. To be honest, I don't know. I don't know any animal that changes the electromagnetic force in the air, or if that's even possible. It always seems to be, though, some kind of telltale sign that they're close by or in the area. Now, it's also interesting how this individual, is getting wood from his woodshed, probably trying to pick up bundles of it in his arms to bring back, and he just gets this feeling of dread. And not, from the way he describes it, it doesn't sound like paranoia per se, because if you read later on in the story, they've been doing this for a while. Sounds like they lived in this house for years, so I'm sure it's probably been pretty rudimentary every winter to go and do what he's doing. And so for him to be like, I never felt danger, this has always kind of been the same, but now all of a sudden this is totally out of the loop for us, something just kind of seems up. And then you add this static feeling in the air, and it's almost kind of creepy, it really adds edge to the story. And so now he's back on his porch loading the wood holder, and he knows that his back is against the wilderness. And that really makes him nervous because now he's vulnerable and the feeling is just intensifying. So what my take out of this is that whatever it is watching him, that we can only suppose is watching him is getting closer. I don't know if it's going to attack him or not, but it sounds like it's creeping towards to maybe get a better look. It only took a moment or two for me to stack the wood in the holder before I turned around and stepped off my porch, only to stop right in my tracks. In my direct line of sight were these glowing yellow eyes staring at me from one of the trees close by the woodshed. I could just barely make out the silhouette of something very large behind the tree, with what looked to be a hand holding onto the tree for support. It was pretty dark outside, but my porch light shone enough where I can make out very minimal details. I remember as soon as I saw those eyes, I noticed the shape of tall ears. I stood there in place, frozen, and this thing, not even a couple seconds later, hides back behind the tree. It was watching me. I felt like I was in danger, so I ran inside my house and grabbed my pistol. Okay, so we were right. This thing was watching him and probably trying to stalk and, get as close as it could to him. Now, I know he mentioned that he turned around and took a step off his porch, but I don't know how far out that the porch light had shown that this thing was behind a tree. I'm assuming probably only 20, 30 feet away if we're talking about just a general porch light. And, him being able to make out as much detail as he did, even though it was a silhouette. So I would probably estimate between 20 to 50 feet by judging by how he's describing what he saw and then the glowing yellow eyes. I'm not going to lie, I would probably cry if I saw something like what he's describing from only 20 or so feet away from me. But he's pretty right on the money about the description. But something that's really, you kind of just see it a lot in encounters that especially I get sent, is people always talk about the ears. And more often than not, it's always the tall, pointy ears. And I don't know if that's just because that's the type of dogman that's most common, but it just seems to be a really common detail in a lot of the descriptions that are told. But maybe that's just because it sticks out, and they're kind of freaky looking, to be honest. If you've ever seen like werewolf masks or, werewolves in movies, and they have those kind of tall, pointed ears with tufts on the end, I would imagine that's probably what it looks like, and that's got to be scary. But one of the things that really kind of stands out to me too about this part of the story is how it was watching him from behind a tree with its hand outstretched, holding on to the trunk. Like, that's freaky. That means it was holding on for support, trying to look at him more. And it realized that he saw it, so it quickly hid back behind the tree, trying to stay hidden. So whatever this thing was not only trying to stalk him, but also want to try and stay hidden. And that's quite freaky, to say the least. So far, everything's sounding pretty true. Nothing's sounding embellished or outlandish thus far, so let's listen on. My wife was wondering why I was pale and had run inside so quickly, grabbing my gun. I explained to her there's a large animal or something outside, and we need to stay inside and be quiet. I was terrified at that moment, but looking back, I think it was more because of the unknown at the time. Anyway, I waited inside for a few hours for this thing to be gone and courageously had made my way back outside to grab some more wood, since we were just about out of all the wood inside that we had. As soon as I stepped outside, the feeling was lifted. It was closer to 9 or 10 p.m. at this point. The woods were quiet, and the air felt normal again. Things were calm. I wasn't taking chances though, and I remember I had never stacked wood so fast in my life after that. Okay, see, there's another shift in the story. Now, this is also kind of weird because, not weird in what he's recounting, but weird in the events that are taking place. Now, he goes back outside, there's no static in the air, and everything kind of feels normal again. So maybe I was right in the fact that these things do change the air around them, and that maybe they aren't a flesh and blood animal. And because it seems that when they come in and out of the area, like I said, the air changes. Again, I really don't know the full scope of that and what that would mean and the details that come with it, but it's definitely a very strange occurrence. So judging by everything being calm again, it kind of sounds like it left the area for now. Maybe it's because these creatures are smart enough to know that once they're spotted, they kind of step back a little bit and go back into hiding. I'm not exactly sure. Let's listen and hear what he has to say. I quickly filled up our outside wood storage. The rest of the night was uneventful. The following morning, I was curious to see if there'd be any tracks in the dirt. And keep in mind it hadn't snowed yet. So I walked out to where I saw this thing standing behind the tree. There was nothing. No signs of nothing. The dirt below didn't even look disturbed. I was confused and began to think I was going crazy. Things did calm down after that, and for the next week, everything was normal, as I recall. I want to say it was the following weekend where I took my wife out to dinner and a movie. As we're pulling back up in the driveway, our headlights shine on the largest black wolf I have ever seen in my life. We're about 3/4 the way up our driveway, just as we're pulling into our house, and this large wolf walks right past our house into the field. It looked right over at us and even looked disfigured. I've never seen a wolf like that. It looked like it came from a toxic waste dump or something, or deformed even. My wife was screaming. This thing, I kid you not, was easily the size of a buffalo. It was utterly massive. My wife was panicking and quickly ran into the house. I didn't know what to think, to be honest, so I just kept my pistol at my nightstand, ready in case this thing tried to break into the house. Alright, so we got some pretty interesting descriptions so far. So they're driving back home, they're pulling back up to their house, and this large, what he described as a buffalo-sized black wolf walks across, I think, his driveway out into a field, or walks by his house. I can't quite remember exactly how he said it, but either way, that kind of coincides with a lot of other accounts and sightings that people talk about. For whatever reason, like a smoky gray, dark gray, black with gray is like probably one of the most common colors that you hear about talked with Dogman. A lot of times people just describe them as jet black, which is very common, but a detail that really stood out to me, and I'm sure a lot of you too, is that he talked about the face. And it wasn't just, it had a wolf-like face, or it had a long snout, or it looked wolf-like or dog-like. It was the fact that he mentioned it being deformed looking, that it had a toxic waste dump kind of mutated kind of look to it, is kind of what I got out of it. And I almost wonder if that's maybe his interpretation of the whole hyena / wolf looking Dogman type of thing, or if this thing could have previously been in a fight with other cryptids. It's really hard to say, or if it was just maybe a new iteration of Dogman. I don't know. Maybe that was his way to just describe how ugly it looked. It's really hard to tell accurately, because I know a lot of people, who've sent me encounters have talked about the face, and sometimes you'll hear them say how ugly they are and how nasty looking they are. But I've never heard the term like deformed necessarily. So that would make me think that like there might be features that are disproportionate, or parts of the face that look wrong. And it's also really interesting that he talked about it being the size of a buffalo. I think it was somewhere in the Midwest where the term buffalo wolves is actually a thing. I don't know if they're wolves or if they're a type of wolf that used to live, but I've heard people talk about Dogman as basically being buffalo wolves, and I'm not too familiar on that whole topic and connection there, but I know if you like research it in Google, I'm sure there's some correlation between the two, because I have heard the two mentioned together. But yeah, let's go ahead and move on. Before we do, though, I should say that so far everything sounds pretty on the money, and from the way he describes it to the events that are happening, it's quite frightening, and I feel sorry for this individual that this thing is on his property. This is where things changed. The following nights, we begin to hear howling off in the distance. We've heard packs of coyotes hollering and whooping off in the distance before, but this was different. This was powerful howling. So powerful you can feel the vibrations. It was so loud. And we'd hear bizarre animal noises outside of our house sometimes at night. Everything from tapping, clicking, shuffling, rustling, you name it. It felt like our house was being watched over by something. Again, guys, this thing's in the area. This thing's stalking them now. It's doing all sorts of funky, weird stuff to their house. And this is pretty common what they do. They'll, for whatever reason, pace around your house, so they'll walk around your house. And I'm not sure if it's to intimidate or to incite fear or to have them let you know that they're there, but it's weird and they tend to do it. Now, the different noises I don't know too much about, but I definitely have heard them tapping on the side of the house, running their claws or scraping the wall. The clicking, I have not heard about that before. And I'm assuming that the rustling and shuffling is probably just this thing moving around in the grass or moving around outside of their house. Since it's so large, it surprisingly is able to make no noise going around like a lot of people say, but maybe it's purposely wanting to make noise just to, again, intimidate and incite fear. One morning, my wife came running in the house in hysterics because she was walking down to the mailbox to check the mail, since our mailbox is all the way at the end of our driveway. And she said that huge black wolf that we saw nights ago was standing on 2 legs in the driveway, growling at her, walking towards her. She began screaming and crying and ran back into the house. She was frantic and was begging me to grab my gun, worried that this thing was headed right to our house at this very moment. I went to grab my pistol, but as I picked it up from my nightstand, the realization that this thing would only tickle this animal. And in that very moment, I felt like some wounded prey that was about to be eaten. So the fact that this thing would, I can only assume, be in broad daylight, actually walked towards his wife in a menacing manner. She didn't really say much more than that, but it sounded like this thing was walking towards her to do God only knows what. And it's no wonder this poor lady came in screaming and crying for her husband. That's pretty frightening. And I know I've heard from other sources and stories where they talk about if a dogman is willing to show itself so openly in daylight, especially in a case like this, and come towards you in any sort of aggressive manner or show any aggression, it usually is like the worst sign you could possibly have with a dogman encounter. This is quite frightening, actually, and it's funny, too, because he mentions that he kind of just has the realization that this little pistol that he has isn't going to do a darn thing to the whatever this animal is that's outside, and I think he's fully accepted that this thing's literally just probably going to tickle this creature, whatever it may be. I glanced outside to see if maybe I could see it somewhere, but I didn't see it anywhere outside. My wife basically went and hid for the rest of the day, too scared to even be out, and I never heard or saw that thing outside. I didn't go outside looking, though. It's possible it could have been an ambush waiting to happen, but I'm not sure. Things continued and continued to get worse. I would find mutilated deer carcasses in my front yard. In fact, one time while coming home from work and driving up my driveway, there was a deer carcass right in the middle of the driveway. It looked like it had a few limbs ripped off, and it was disemboweled gruesomely from the view I had in my driver's seat with my headlights right on it. I had a bad feeling, like this animal had been purposefully killed and left here, knowing I would have to get out and move it so I could drive through, making me vulnerable just long enough to get me. This thing thought intelligently, and it really scared me. I just drove around the carcass over the side slopes of the driveway. I truly felt trapped. This animal, whatever it was that I had never seen before, had been tormenting us for reasons I will never know. Those were the major events that happened. Things continued like this for a while. Finally, around March-April time, things finally started quieting down. We hadn't noticed, but the deer had actually disappeared from that area entirely the past few months over the winter, which really never happens. We realized that when we saw much of the deer come back to the area around springtime, we hadn't had any weird feelings and things got back to normal for the most part. I apologize for this being so long, but I just can't quite put my finger on what kind of animal would do such a thing. My wife and I are still baffled alone at the fact that this creature even exists. If any one of you out there has any information on what we might have been dealing with, please let us know. I mentioned earlier we hadn't seen this thing since February or March, and are glad that it seems like it left the area. We've lived here for years now, and have never encountered something as unusual as this. However, with winter approaching again, we're not sure if this animal will show back up. That is something that truly worries me. So first I want to say that I love stories like this where they're long, and there's a lot of diversity that happens. It's not just it ran across the road or it was appearing in my window. I mean, there's a literal series of events that happens in just this one encounter story, encounter story, I would say. And I always love reading stories like that, and in my opinion adds so much more dimension to the whole Dogman phenomenon. And the stories themselves, I mean, I'm sure you guys like hearing stories with a little more dimension to them than just a single experience or event that took place. Near the end, though, he talks about having a deer carcass literally laid in his driveway. And I think he was right that this thing, will probably not only mutilate all the deer in the area or a lot, but purposely left the carcass there for him so he can get out of the car to try and move it, giving this creature just enough time to be subtle enough to get him. And I don't know how accurate that is, but I feel like that's a pretty good assumption based on the fact that it already showed itself in broad daylight walking towards his wife. It was stalking him in his house before. It stayed in the area and tapped on his house, and what I believe to be intimidating and inciting fear. It was clearly hanging around his house when they got back from their date or whatever it is that they were doing. So this thing is literally tormenting this couple, and for whatever reason is, I wouldn't say showing aggression, but it's definitely being very open and bold with its movements. And then for it to be killing the deer in the area and then doing stuff like this. I've heard of Bigfoot chasing deer into the road so a car would hit it so they can go get the roadkill. So I don't know if this is a similar thing. I don't know if this Dogman, even if it was the Dogman, had laid the carcass there in the driveway, to basically trying to put a roadblock so he couldn't come up the driveway. I don't know. But personally, I like to believe that it was probably a trap or a setup of some kind. Because like he said, even he realized that these creatures are so intelligent, it is frightening. That these are literally wild beasts that are ultimate killing machines that are more intelligent than we are. And they are literally assassins. They are quiet. You can't see them. You can't hear them. They're just there and they're watching. And I want to say that's probably the most frightening aspect of all of these stories. Now, the interesting part of this entire encounter story, I want to say, is the fact that it's seasonal based. I've only ever heard of a handful of other encounters that they have these reoccurring encounters and that they keep seeing this thing multiple times in this time period of where they live. It's happened a few times. There was one story on Vic Hundiff where it was this lady and this thing kept visiting her. And gosh, I wish I could remember what episode it was, but it was really good. But those who have listened to it, you'll know because she kept crying a lot in the episode and it was really traumatizing and her mom wouldn't believe her. And anyway, it was a really good encounter. If I can find it again, I'll probably talk about it. But I digress. This encounter kind of reminded me of that, just how it kept coming back. But the whole seasonal thing. I've heard of other cases where they talk about the whole wintertime thing and they seem to be in the area, but I'm not sure if Dogmen migrate. I don't know if they move around, but I find it interesting, though, that it was only there for those few months and now it seems to be gone. So, who really knows? But, maybe I'll get an email back from the same person this winter saying that this thing's back. So I don't know. I'm kind of anticipating to see what happens, but maybe it was just passing through. Why it was passing through for as long as it was, I'm not sure. There's a lot of what ifs, but I would say the ultimate, is it truth or myth? I'm going to lean on truth because this whole encounter experience, I should say, is pretty profound and frightening. There's a lot of details. There's a lot of things going on. It's not just one singular event. Again, great story. It was well written, so I'm going to definitely say that this one is probably true. So let's move to encounter 2. Spring of 2012. My wife and I are driving back from visiting family. The drive to get them is quite long, like 8 or so hours, and so it's pretty early on in the AM. I'd say maybe 2 in the morning. We were only an hour or so away from home at the time. We're coming up to a bend in the road when our headlights illuminate this wolf-like creature, crouched down on the side of the road, just staring off. I noticed a wolf-like face with pointed ears. My wife was asleep, and I remember gasping and swerving the car as far away from this thing as I could. It was rather large. I would estimate it to be around 8 feet tall, if not even taller. The sudden swerving of the vehicle woke my wife up and had her asking me what the hell I was doing. I told her that there was some huge animal on the side of the road and I didn't want to hit it. Thankfully, My wife never had to see it. Then. Fast forward almost 9 months later, and now we're in winter. And my wife and I are coming home again from going out from running errands or something. I can't quite remember, but I remember we were out all day because it was roughly 8 p.m. at night. I remember it was maybe around 8 p.m. or so, but since it was winter and it gets dark early, my perception of time might be a little off. Anyway, at this point, we're in an entirely different area of town where I saw the last wolf thing. The way we were coming back to the house, you have to go through about a 2-mile stretch of this more lone, straight road, with lots of wood and brush on one side, with the other side being more open, undeveloped land. We're driving this road, hadn't been on it for maybe a minute, and this large black shape runs out of the brush on our left behind us and chases our car. My wife and I both panic, and I floor the car. As I'm gaining speed rapidly, this thing catches up to our vehicle and then darts off back into the brush. My wife is freaking out. I'm freaking out. This was some werewolf-looking creature chasing our car. I should note that there were streetlights on this road, so there my wife and I got a decent look at this being, even though it only chased our vehicle for probably 30 seconds at most. I'll describe it for you. It was black and looked really shaggy. It had a wolf-like face and snout, and larger teeth. I didn't see anything with the eyes or really much else. It also looked different from the wolf creature I saw 9 months prior to driving home. Similar, but different looking. The wife and I try to forget about it as best we can. We have to take that long stretch of road anytime we want to go a specific way into town. Fortunately for us, we haven't encountered it since that event. Okay, so this is a much more shorter story, but again, a very interesting story in that in the whole encounter experience, there's 2 individual encounters. Now, he talks about the first encounter being a creature that is wolf-like, but later in the story, he mentions that the first creature he saw looked different than the second one that chased him. So I want to say that's probably like one of the only few stories, again, that I've read that actually features 2 different dogmen in the same story, which, again, is very unique. The way he describes it is so far pretty truthful, and you know, he hasn't given me any more elaborate details via email other than just what he sent, but it sounds pretty truthful from the most part of how he describes it in the series of events that took place. The first one I've heard of other experiences where people have had where they've kind of come across a part in the road where this thing is like looking out and watching the road, or looking out and watching traffic, or I don't know what that's all about from the Dogman side, but it's quite odd. And then the second one, the fact that he was chased by this thing, that this thing literally got out of the brush or jumped out onto the road and chased their car for who knows what. These things seem to really thrive off intimidation and fear, and I don't know if this is one of those things or who knows what, why it chose them, why it chased them, what exactly did it look like. But these poor people were literally terrified. I mean, can you imagine this giant wolf thing jumping out onto the road and chasing your car and catching up with you even though you're speeding up like crazy? I can't even imagine. So, the second part of the encounter, he talked about it being like black. So it almost makes me think of that maybe it's a different type of dogman, and I don't know if there's different types in the same area. I don't know how that works, if that's even a thing. I can't really think of encounters off the top of my head that talk about seeing, type 1 in this area and then type 2 in the same area but over here. But I'm sure they exist because obviously from what we all gather that there's multiple types of dogmen. So who knows what they saw and why they saw what they saw. I also don't know too much about the area in which they were living in that this occurred, but there might just be more than one that are moving into suburban areas, which kind of seem to be the case. Unfortunately, it doesn't really seem like a lot of us are safe anymore, regardless if we're in little suburbia in town or if we're out in the countryside. So we're kind of screwed no matter what, and it seems like these things are moving in on people because I'm hearing more and more encounters of these people who have these experiences, and they're literally like downtown, or they're in like a casual neighborhood, or they're in a city park or something, and they see these things. So it's quite frightening how often these things are appearing. So anyway, to recap, I'm going to say that with all the details given and the descriptions given in the story, I'm going to say it also leans on the true side along with number 1. Nothing outlandish, nothing that stands out as too crazy or out there. It just sounds like a really frightening series of Dogman encounters. So anyway, let's get on to story 3. I was about 15 when this happened to me and my friend. I'm 32 now, so this was quite a while back. We were out on his father's property, shooting off pellet guns, thinking we were badass. Practicing our aim, actually, if I remember right. We had quite a few old Folgers cans we had sitting at the top of old fence posts, and we'd try to see who could shoot them from the farthest point away. This was all dandy and fun, and we were having a great time. This was in July, so it was hot as balls outside. I remember because I had a couple of cigs on me at the time, and had the thought that I didn't want to light one out there because all of the tall, dead grass could ignite. See, out where he was, he had a lot of fields around him with a lot of grass that was unkempt, and fire season usually got pretty bad. Anyway, after about an hour of us doing this, I told my friend that nature was calling, and so I walked into the nearby forest that's surrounding the entire property where we were shooting off of our pellet guns. I walked in, maybe no more than 100 feet, to the base of a tree and started pissing. I'm almost done going to the bathroom and I sense that somebody is looking at me. I glance over to my right, and to my horror, not even 20 feet away from me is a monster straight out of a Hollywood movie. A werewolf. Except it was scarier than I ever could have imagined. This thing was hulking. It looked like someone took the head of a wolf and stuck it on a hairy bodybuilder. This werewolf's head was massive, like the size of a lion's. It stared at me right in the eyes, and I saw just how smart this thing was. It's like it realized that I realized it existed, and it was what it was. It did something next that's even hard for me to talk about, because it scares me so bad. This thing gave me the evilest grin. Yes, it smiled at me. Think of how when you watch the movie How the Grinch Stole Christmas, and all the evil faces that he would make that would scare you. It was like that. This creature was so intelligent that it grinned at me, like it had me all alone to itself, and was going to rip my guts out and eat me. And I knew there was nothing I could do about it. I got an overwhelming feeling this thing wanted to hurt me. I had never felt pure evil like that in my life. This thing was jet black and had piercing amber-colored eyes, and the biggest teeth I've ever seen on any animal. It began to extend its arms towards me, and took a couple of steps, and I ran so fast out there, back into the field where my friend is shooting off the pellet gun. I didn't even stop. I just yell at him to get back into the house now. My friend, confused, accepted my motion and ran back to the house with me. When we got back to the house, he was freaking out, wondering what was going on and what happened. He could tell I was out of breath, pale, and shaken up. I tried to explain to him what had happened and what I had seen. He would quickly glance behind me and around, and he kept checking back, and said he never saw anything following him or us the entire time. I honestly don't know what it is I saw, but I never want to be around it again. Funny enough, only months later, me and him would go back to that same property to do some hunting, hiking, and all the above, and we never encountered anything beyond the ordinary. It was only that one event, which is strange. Oddly enough, as the years would go by, I kept in contact with this friend. In fact, not even that long ago, him and I had a discussion about reminiscing on old times, and he told me other weird things would happen on that property. He said one that really freaked him out in particular was that he would hear these really loud metal scraping noises off in the distance. Now, his father owns about 200 acres of forest game land all around their property, and beyond that is state-owned game land. So there is nothing but miles and miles of middle-of-nowhere woods and forest surrounding him. There is no reason loud metal scraping should be coming anywhere near the forest or near his house. He told me it really spooked him. This one's also really frightening, and funny enough, this story is actually really similar to the whole airsoft story that I'm sure many of you heard, where the kid goes into the woods and he's like playing hide and go seek with his cousin or something like that, and he sees this thing and it charges at him, and he runs out and tells his cousin. Anyway, the story is like really close to that. It really reminds me of that. But so these two kids are out there shooting their pellet guns, and he obviously goes to go piss, and this thing is there in the woods apparently. And I don't know. It's weird that you have some encounters like this where the individual has no sense that they're there, and all of a sudden these things are just there. Like there's no smell, there's no feeling in the air, there's no being watched. There's none of that. Poor guy didn't even know, and then next thing he knows, this thing is 10 feet away from him. And with all the details he gave, it's horrifying, man. He got it down to a T with the description. I mean, I can't even imagine having this 9-10 foot tall hulking behemoth of a demon wolf standing there, not even that far away from you. And then he talks about it outstretching his arms, walking towards him. I haven't really heard that in a whole lot of encounters, but that's really the only thing to me that's probably new, and I don't know if that's a little on the false side. But then he talks about running out of there, and his friend runs with him, and they run back to, I'm assuming, his friend's house, from what it describes in the story. And his friend looks back, doesn't see anything, and then he talks about that he went back and visited that area later on. You know, I'm not quite sure about this story, actually. He might be 100% honest, and he might be on the money with what he's talking about, but the only thing that I really feel like this story is disproven, in my opinion, is the fact that it reached out and tried to grab him, or it reached out and tried to walk towards him. And I know a lot of you might disagree with me and might believe that he's actually, this did happen to him. I think there's just something about the way it's written. I don't know. There's just something that tells me that I don't know if I just necessarily personally believe this story. But he does also talk about at the end that his friend had told him that, he would hear these weird, what he described as metal scraping noises off in the wilderness. And from what it sounds like, his father owns a lot of the property in the area, and beyond that is state game land. So there's miles of wilderness all around them. There's nothing that's going to be making sounds like that. So, who knows what it could have been. Obviously something strange, and it kind of coincides with a lot of the events that would, if any of you have listened to the search and rescue series that I covered, there's a lot of strange things that happen that are very similar to that metal scraping noise. And it just so happens he's in game land, or state game land, and acreages of forest and stuff, and he's hearing some of the same noises. So very weird. And then of course he sees the Dogman. So maybe it is true. I don't know. I'm actually kind of on the fence with this one the more I think about it. So I don't think I've ever done this, since the whole point of the show is either truth or myth. But I think I'm actually going to side just on the middle, and I'll leave it up to you guys, whatever you think of story number 3. So again, I'm neutral, and we'll move to the next story. I saw something years back when I was visiting the Buck Shoals State Park. It's a tradition of my friends and me that every year we like to go hiking around the park. Summer and fall is the time of the year that we try and go, just because that's kind of our best availability. In fact, one of our favorite spots to hit in the park is the Chattahoochee River. With all the surrounding timber, it's beautiful, and the fresh air is just fantastic on the lungs. We decide after a while of hanging out at the river to hike in further like we usually do. I like to lead the way, and this time was no exception. I led the way with my friends, about 50 yards behind me. Generally, I like to scout out the area ahead, just to look for cool things to check out. Before, there's been trails, markings, animal tracks, bones, anything that's interesting that I deem worth stopping for. This time, though, I would run into something that I've had a hard time dealing with. I've actually had to seek a therapist for what I saw, just to try and convince myself that I'm not crazy, that I did indeed see an animal that isn't supposed to exist. For some of us, when you see something like that, it shatters your realm of reality. Anyway, I was walking further ahead of my friends, and I noticed a small clearing that dipped down. I figured we would cross the clearing and continue on venturing on. But as I approached the clearing, I saw at the bottom of the hill looked to be a large animal eating a dead deer. I stopped in my tracks at first, thinking it was a large bear eating on the carcass. Right off the bat though, something about the animal just seemed off. It didn't look right. Where I was standing, I could only really see it from behind, and it had a weird shape to it. I know we have sizable black bear down here, and that's what popped in my head at first. After not even 10 seconds, this thing must have noticed me being around, because it stopped eating and lifted its head in the air and began sniffing, just like how a dog would. To my horror, that's when I saw more details. The longer snout, the pointier ears. It shifted its body as it lifted its head up, so I was able to see more details of the body. This thing looked like a giant dark gray wolf that looked, well, mutated. I don't know how else to describe it other than that. It really freaked me out. My friends came up behind me, wondering why I was standing still and silent. Without breaking eye contact with this thing sniffing, I quickly motioned for them to look out into the clearing. Both of my friends gasping, and my one buddy saying, "What the hell is that thing?" After what seemed like minutes of this thing sniffing the air, even though it was probably only 10 seconds, I said, "Guys, we need to turn around and leave." We all left the area, and I wasn't going to chance sticking around and having this thing notice us. I'm blown away that this thing probably caught our scent, but either A, never saw us, or B, knew we were there and realized we weren't a threat. I'm really not sure. I was roughly about 100 to 200 yards away if I had to guess. What I saw looked like a giant black mass that looked more canine than anything. I've seen black bear many times, and this thing didn't quite look like a black bear. It was lighter in color and bigger. Plus, the shape was just different, especially as it started moving its body. I like this story a lot too. Already to start things off, I'm going to say that this story is true, just based off the way he described events, the location. I've read actually other encounters about that area in Alabama. I believe it's Alabama, maybe it's Georgia. It's one of the two states. It might be Georgia. And what he described is seeing this, big wolf creature eating this deer carcass. It's kind of frightening, but it's right on the money. He's, he comes upon this clearing because he's hiking with his friends. He's obviously leading the way, and he sees this thing down there. One thing that really, I guess a detail that stood out to me in the story is how this thing's eating this carcass without a care that anybody could come across it. And he sees it, and this thing must sense that he's there, not far away. And so it lifts its body up in the air and starts sniffing. Well, obviously this freaks him out, but it's like this thing had to have smelt him, but maybe it just didn't care enough. I don't know. It's weird to me how there's so many stories where these things don't want to be seen, and then there's other stories where these things want to be seen, and then there's other stories where these things are seen and they don't care. Like in this case, where they don't even acknowledge the individual. A lot of that is like, when it crosses the road and it doesn't even look over at you, but it does it slowly and carelessly. It's kind of the same thing. This whole sighting in particular is strange, but not dismissive. I mean, like I said, it sounds truthful to me, and I would believe it to be true. But these encounters, I think there's only like a handful of other encounters that I've read, maybe like 3 or 4, including one on Vic's show, where somebody talks about coming to a clearing and seeing these things out in a clearing or a field and eating something and dismissing them as huge wolves. So it's just a really interesting account. And for those who know that state park, yikes, I would hate to ever go back to the area because, like I said, I've read other similar encounters of seeing those same types of creatures in and around that whole area. So let's move on to the final story, guys. Again, to recap for story 4, I'm going to say it's true. And so far, that only makes one story that was on the neutral side. So we'll see how story 5 goes. This occurred just last week when my mother was driving home from working late one night. She lives out in a woodier area with a lot of farmland around her. I'm talking acres and acres of farmland. I think a lot of it is actually mainly used for cattle. Anyway, she was coming around a bend in the road when red eye shine was caught in her headlights. Some sort of creature, she says, stepped out onto the road in front of her on 2 feet. This thing then quickly walked across the road and cleared it in only a few steps. It passed by in only mere seconds, but it was enough time for my mother to get somewhat of a good look at it. Okay, so far she's out driving late, right? So it's nighttime, and you got the whole farmland thing. So I mean, already right there, you got like some of the major setting for a Dogman encounter to happen. She's out in the country, she's around farmland. Again, it's dark, she's driving, and this thing steps out in the road, and she sees eye shine, red eye shine. So that's an interesting detail because you don't really get a whole lot of encounters that specifically say red eye shine. It's either this thing didn't have eye shine, there was eye shine, or its eyes glowed red or glowed amber or glowed yellow, but never red eye shine. So maybe it's just her way of saying that this thing had red glowing eyes. Maybe I'm just overthinking it, but I don't know, it's just an interesting detail for me. Let's move on. She said it was really tall and estimated it to be between 7 to 10 feet tall. She said it was lankier and it had a dark, smoky gray fur color. This thing never glanced over at her approaching on the road, but the side profile reminded her of a large German Shepherd head. If I remember correctly, this story is based around Knox County, Ohio, which also happens to be the same area in which a lot of these same type of dogmen are. By that I mean the ones that look like German Shepherds and are more lankier. It seems like the bodybuilding ones are the ones that are jet black on other areas of the country, but I've read accounts of them being in the area as well, so it kind of goes back to the 2 different types of dogmen in one area kind of thing. So anyway, it's just interesting because you get a lot of accounts of the German Shepherd lankier dogman type in around the Lake Michigan and Wisconsin area, as well as Ohio, Indiana. That whole kind of area is full of those specific encounter types. The body reminded her of a man, a very skinny, lanky man, covered in dark gray fur. She also noticed this being to have long black claws on the tips of its hands, with the hands being what she can only say would resemble raccoon-like hands from what she saw, even though she only saw it for a couple of seconds. That's all that time would allow her to see, and she didn't get any extra details in the muzzle, ears, if it had a tail, etc. She was doing about 50-55 miles an hour when it walked across the road in front of her for a few seconds. Then, she slowed down to about 30 or so, accordingly. Once it crossed, she continued to still slow down, a result of being partially in shock at what she had seen, and worried that there might be more crossing the road right behind it. She kept on driving though, after a few moments of realizing there was no more coming. She had a hard time sleeping that night, believing that what she saw was some sort of unknown animal. She told me that she's never seen an animal like that in her life, and has never heard of such things. I'm one of the only people that's been told about it besides some of her close friends. My mother isn't into the paranormal, but there's no explaining what she saw that night. This occurred not too far away from Knox County, Ohio. Alright guys, to end this episode, I'm going to go ahead and say that story 5 is probably more likely true. Just the setting, the time and place, the what she saw, the how she saw, and the why she saw, all kind of line up with your typical Dogman encounter descriptions. So far, out of these 5 stories, nothing was too outlandish, nothing stood out of place really, other than a couple details here and there on story 3. But again, I'll leave that all up to you to decide, since I am neutral on that one. But the other 4 I'm going to side with truth on, just based on the accounts and the way they are described as well as written, regardless of how good or bad the person is at writing the story. I hope you all enjoyed episode 7 and will stick around for episode 8, when I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to cover, but we'll figure it out. So this Dogman one was kind of on the fly, and I kind of thought it'd be nice to go back and cover a Dogman episode, which I don't think I've done since episode 1, other than the whole Dogman and Skinwalker combined episode that I did. It was either the last episode or the episode before that. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you all in episode 8.